All right, here we go. Japan's national parks are unlike any I've ever encountered. In a country that spans from subarctic Hokkaido in the north to the subtropical Okinawa in the south, from the depths of the ocean floor to the sacred summit of Mount Fuji, it's no wonder that Japan's national parks are a vibrant reflection of this country's unique biological and geological diversity. In this video, we're going to dive deep into the history and roots of the Japanese national park system, examine how these parks are managed and administered, and figure out what all of this might be able to tell us about the Japanese approach to conservation. This is how national parks work in Japan. Hello and welcome to probably the nerdiest breakdown you will ever find on Japanese National Park administration in the English language. If you make it to the end of this one, well, thank you, that's very kind, but also you must really like parks, so I'm glad you're here. Let's start off by getting our bearings a bit here. I mentioned in the intro that the islands of Japan stretch from the subarctic Hokkaido in the north to the subtropical Okinawa in the south, a distance of nearly 2,000 miles and 25 degrees of latitude. That's roughly equivalent to the east coast of the United States. Then you throw in the verticality of these islands, stretching from sea level all the way to the top of Mount Fuji at over 12,000 feet and all those elevations in between. Then you throw in the incredible biological and geological diversity of Japan. 2/3 of Japan is mountainous, but there are also volcanoes, beaches, rivers, forests, wetlands, grasslands. Sanin Kaigan National Park has a massive dune field inside of it. You'll find more endemic species in Japan than other island chains of similar size like the British Isles or New Zealand. You'll find both the world's largest and smallest mammals here, grizzly and black bears, tropical cats. You'll find mammals you've probably never even heard of, giant salamanders, 90,000 native species. This is the landscape we're talking about here. An incredible amount of biological and geological diversity stuffed jam-packed into a relatively small area. And within this landscape sits Japan's 34 national parks, covering more than 5 million acres, or roughly 6% of the country's total land area. Now, the history of these parks is pretty intertwined with how they've ultimately come to be managed today. So let's take a minute to talk about that. The earliest efforts to create national parks in Japan date back to 1911, when advocates sought to designate an imperial park at Nikko. But this early parks movement was fraught with bureaucratic infighting, ideological disputes, and political interference, so it didn't really take off right away. It never got off the ground. Japan even had its own version of the conservation versus preservation debate that dominated US national park discourse around the turn of the 20th century, including having their own Muir and Pinchot analogs. But in 1931, national parks did in fact finally come to Japan with the passage of the National Parks Act. In March 1934, Japan's first 3 national parks were created: Seto Naikai, Unzen, and Kirishima. 9 more followed over the next 2 years. Then there was a world war, and then 8 more parks were created between 1947 and 1955. This era of Japanese national park development was really characterized by tourism and economic development. Like, that was pretty explicitly the goal for this new national park system, at least in the beginning, rather than biodiversity conservation or something like ecosystem function. These parks were seen as a way to stimulate local economies and attract domestic and foreign tourists. This isn't entirely different from the early days of national parks in the United States. That tourism element was definitely very much present during that time, but Japan really kind of took this to another level. To the point where in 1957, Japan had to pass another law called the Natural, N-A-T-U-R-A-L, Natural Parks Act. This law came about as a result of the rampant and widespread development that had been happening within Japanese national parks up to this time. they had kind of taken the whole tourism and economic development thing a little too far and needed a better system to manage these parks and ultimately place a greater emphasis on conservation, which we'll get to that whole system in a minute, because this law also highlighted an aspect of Japanese national parks that is very different from an American-style national park system, and very important to understand why Japanese national parks look and operate the way they do today. See, Japanese national parks fall under a category of protected areas that the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, considers working landscapes. These are what they call a Category 5 protected area. Basically, this means that they accommodate high levels of human development while still adhering to an overall conservation mandate. It's a pretty flexible designation and imparts an overall higher level of disturbance than, say, a wilderness area in America. So, for instance, people still live in Japanese national parks, entire communities and villages. People practice agriculture and forestry, and the Japanese refer to these as secondary nature. You'll find hotels and resorts and restaurants and cultural sites like shrines and temples. Lots of things that you wouldn't typically associate with national parks in the United States, which mostly fall under a Category 2 or a traditional national park type of protected area under those IUCN guidelines. This level of human influence is clearly reflected in Japan's visitation numbers to their national parks. In 2016, the latest year I could find data, Japan's national parks saw more than 365 million visitors, including a staggering 110 million visitors to Fuji Hakone Izu National Park, home of Mount Fuji. That is bonkers, y'all. If you tried to put 110 million visitors in the Smokies or Yellowstone or Grand Canyon, these parks would just totally cease to function and their ecosystems would be destroyed. So in 2016, for comparison, our national park system here in the US saw 331 million visitors, less than Japan, and our most visited national park unit that year, the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, saw just over 15 million visitors. So you can see the scale here, see how differently they are. But Japanese national parks, again, have always had visitation in mind. They're kind of set up for this, and they have been since the beginning. And plus, Fuji is also kind of an outlier. If you took it out of the visitation numbers, it would be spread out much more manageably across the rest of the system. And for Japan, the system that they created was pretty much a necessity if they wanted to have a national park system at all. This is a country that has been settled by humans for a very long time and has been settled very densely. There is a long history of private land ownership here, and plopping down a bunch of American-style national parks on this situation was basically an impossibility. Here, take two examples from the United States. In the Western US, which also has a long history of human settlement, but if you ask the US government, it was uninhabited and thus ripe for the designation of a bunch of already federally owned land as national parks. Japan didn't have this situation. A better analog for the Japan national park situation is actually probably from the eastern United States. That part of the country, like Japan, was also densely populated and had a long history of private land ownership. In order to create national parks here and operate them like in the West, the US government had to acquire large amounts of land, which took a long time and was very expensive and came at a tremendous human cost. This is why there are very few national parks in the eastern United States and why they are much smaller than their western counterparts. The style of system that we operate here in the US just isn't conducive to the land management that we already have in the eastern United States. This is the situation in basically all of Japan. Again, densely populated and lots of private land. So instead of the American method of spending a bunch of time and money and effort getting a bunch of national park land under federal control and displacing a bunch of people, Japan instituted their more hybrid style working landscape approach. As a result, Japanese national parks have a much more diverse mix of ownership within their borders. 25.6% is privately owned. Contrast that with just 3% in the United States national parks. 12.4% is owned by local or prefectural governments, and 64% is owned by the Japanese state. And actually, within that 62%, the vast majority of it is managed by the Japanese Forestry Agency. The Ministry of Environment, which oversees and manages the national parks, only owns 0.2% of all Japanese national park land. These numbers can also be highly variable from park to park. So Ise-shima National Park in west central Honshu is 96% privately owned, while Daisetsuzan National Park on Hokkaido is 94% publicly owned. So a lot of ownership diversity there. But again, that's kind of the point. These are working landscapes in which people coexist within national park boundaries. But as you can imagine, this hodgepodge of ownership does make management of these national parks somewhat difficult. You have all of these conflicting interests and mandates and profit motives that need to be accommodated, yet balanced with the fact that these national parks do still serve the purpose of conservation, which is much more heavily emphasized now than it was in the early days. If this sounds familiar, I might remind you of the dual mandate that US national parks have to accommodate visitors while preserving the landscape. Yeah, this is one of those universal truths about national parks. You have to find a way to balance the people and the nature. Except in Japan, due to the highly fragmented ownership and management landscape, that job is all the more difficult and requires a concerted effort to coordinate, communicate, and cooperate in order to protect these places effectively. And here is where you're probably going to notice the biggest departure from the type of national park protection that you're used to, at least if you're used to American-style national park management. First of all, Japanese national parks are only the top rung on a three-tiered system of national protected areas. That natural parks law that we talked about passed way back in 1957, yeah, it created this system and it placed national parks at the top as the premier protected places in Japan. These are supposed to be, quote, superb landscapes of national significance, end quote, that are at least 75,000 acres, 5,000 of which should be a core area that, quote, has hardly been affected by detrimental development action, end quote. To borrow a phrase from the US, these are the crown jewels of the Japanese protected areas network. Below national parks in this hierarchy sit quasi-national parks, which are still quote-unquote beautiful areas, but, quote, fall somewhat short of national park standards, end quote. They should still be somewhat large, roughly 25,000 acres, but the core area can be somewhat smaller, around 2,500 acres, and encompass an ecosystem that is more or less still intact. These are basically B-tier national parks. And finally, at the bottom of this hierarchy are the prefectural parks, basically the Japanese equivalent of a state park. They're designated and managed by the local prefectures themselves and are supposed to protect areas of quote-unquote local significance. Now, if you thought that was different, wait until we talk about zoning. Yes, Japanese national parks are essentially managed via zoning, and this applies to both national parks and quasi-national parks, but not prefectural parks. Here's how it works. Essentially, the area within each national park is assigned a zoning classification. It can either be a special zone or an ordinary zone. And the special zones can be further subdivided into special protection zones or class 1, 2, or 3 special zones. These special zones are considered to be the core area of the national park with the most beautiful scenery, the most intact ecosystems, and the heaviest restrictions on use and development. If you want to do any sort of development in these zones, you will need permission from the Ministry of Environment, so they have a little bit of oversight here. There are restrictions on wild camping, campfires, cutting or collecting wood or plants or rocks, or basically anything like that. These special zones receive the highest levels of protection within the Japanese national park system. And the subdivisions within the special zones, the special protection zones, or the class 1, 2, or 3 zones, are differentiated further, they're stratified by their specific regulations on land use and development. So special protection zones provide the most protection, while class 3 zones provide less. Although, again, all of these still fall under the overall category of special zone with the highest level of protection. And to help you sort of like calibrate this scale, because I know it's different, forestry, agriculture, and fishing would fall into a class 2 special zone. Again, these are working landscapes, so our definition of high levels of protection might be slightly different than the definitions Japan uses for its national park system. On the other hand, you have the ordinary zones, which are considered to be the buffer zones between the core, more protected areas of Japanese national parks and non-national park land. There are far fewer restrictions on development and use within ordinary zones, to the point where you don't even need permission from the Ministry of Environment for development projects. You only need to notify them that you're doing them. You'll find activities like mining and large-scale development projects in these zones. And there's also a third type of zone, technically called a marine park zone, which is really just another high protection type of zone, but it's used in, well, marine areas. Designation of these zones and use regulations are specified in a management plan for each national park, updated every 5 years and broken into a regulatory plan and a facility plan. And that really is the heart of Japanese National Park Administration, a multi-tiered structure stratifying levels of protection based on zones, which themselves allow varying levels of use and development. And the system isn't perfect, right? No park system is. There's the fragmented nature of ownership, the multipolar management structure, the conflicting conservation mandates, a chronic lack of underfunding, the fact that most parkland is actually forestry land, the leniency of development in ordinary zones, the list goes on and on. All of these things are challenges. But this system works in the very unique way that Japan needs it to work, which is what a national park system should do. Adapt a country's conservation ethos to the specific circumstances that country requires. It would be silly to try and slap an American-style park system with our conservation values down in Japan, because you'd be setting it up to fail. It wouldn't work. Conservation in Japan looks different than conservation in the United States. At least it certainly did to me during my visit. At first, I definitely didn't feel like I was in a national park at all. But in my head, I was still in this American park mindset. I did a quick mental recalibration, adjusted my way of thinking, shifted my perspective a little bit, and came to realize that this hybrid style working landscape system was kind of brilliant. Because it's what the situation demands. It's flexible, it's relatively inexpensive, it balances human development with natural resource conservation, and it emphasizes human presence in nature. I think about this all the time, how we've become increasingly isolated and disconnected from nature, how we see ourselves as separate from it. Not so in Japanese national parks. You get the sense that humans belong in these landscapes, that we're a part of them. Sure, we're going to do things that humans do. We're going to build things and modify the land and use it for our own benefit, but we're going to do that from a place of respect and admiration. That's the Japanese approach, knowing that we come from the land and depend on it. That's my big takeaway from visiting Japan's national parks. The commitment to balancing human needs with conservation goals is, I think, something we can all learn from. All right, if you made it to the end here, thanks so much for watching. That was certainly a very nerdy one. I thoroughly enjoyed my time in Japan. I have become quite smitten with this country, as you can tell, and am already trying to figure out how I can go back. Which, if anyone has any connections with the Japanese national parks and wants to fly me back out for a story, I am available. I will work for parks. Please do let me know your thoughts or questions on the episode or on Japanese national parks. Have you ever been to Japan? Did you visit a Japanese national park? I want to hear it all down in the comments. Let me know what you think. If you're new here, this is National Park Diaries, a channel dedicated to telling educational, informative stories about national parks and protected areas from around the world. If that sounds interesting to you, do consider sticking around and joining the community. I think you'll find a lot here that you can be a part of. Check out my Patreon if you're looking to support me more directly. I have lots of benefits over there for as little as $2 per month, including a trip report that I published on my adventures in Japan, and a Discord where you can hang out and chat with fellow park lovers. Follow me on Instagram for park pictures and channel updates, and yeah, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.